Somewhere beneath the Sahara, buried under 10,000 years of silence, there is a riverbed. You cannot see it from the surface. The sand has swallowed every trace, but satellites peer through the dust, and what they find is unmistakable channels carved deep into bedrock wide enough to carry the memory of a world that no longer exists. Water once moved here. Life once gathered along these banks, and then slowly, grain by grain, the desert erased it all. Not destroyed, erased, as if the earth itself decided to forget. Something older than curiosity brought you to this moment, a rhythm you have felt before but never named. The same rhythm that once guided hands across stone in the Andes, that aligned pillars to constellations before agriculture existed, that carried navigators across open ocean with nothing but stars and the memory of swells beneath a wooden hull. It is the rhythm of remembering, and it has been calling quietly for a very long time. What if civilization is not a line climbing upward from darkness into light? What if it is a spiral, rising, collapsing, forgetting, and then rising again from its own ash? What if the ancient world was not primitive at all, but the shadow of something older, still, something that fell so completely that even its ruins were mistaken for beginnings? 12,000 years ago, the ice melted. The seas rose 400 feet. Coastlines vanished beneath cold, dark water. And when the survivors emerged, they did not start from nothing. They carried fragments, geometry, encoded in myth, astronomy, preserved in ritual engineering, remembered in stone. They built not as inventors, but as inheritors. And what they built still stands waiting in dust and silence for someone to ask the right questions. Stay with me, let's drift a little deeper. Begin with the dark, not the dark of a room with the lights turned off, not the shallow dark of closed eyes, but the original dark, the one that existed before anyone was alive to name it. The dark at the bottom of the ocean, where pressure turns water into something almost solid, where the temperature hovers just above freezing and has hovered there for longer than any species on the surface has drawn breath. Down here, 4,000 meters below the waves, the sea floor is not sand. It is sediment, the slow accumulation of everything that has ever fallen from the world above microscopic shells of creatures that lived and died in sunlit waters, drifting downward through miles of cold silence, settling grain by grain into a record no one was meant to read. Each inch of that sediment represents thousands of years, each foot an epoch, and somewhere in those layers, if you know where to look, you will find a thin dark line, a band of ash and chemical disruption that marks the moment when the world above changed forever. That line is a scar. The earth remembers in scars. Now rise. Rise slowly, the way heat rises through stone, the way memory rises through sleep. Leave the ocean floor behind and ascend through water that shifts from black to midnight blue to the deep bruised indigo of twilight depths, where the last photons of sunlight surrender and dissolve. Pass through thermoclines where temperature drops so sharply, your body would register it as a wall, a cold invisible architecture built from nothing but the physics of density and heat exchange. The ocean is not empty space. It is layered time, each stratum holding a different temperature, a different chemistry, a different age. And as you rise through it, you're moving not just through water, but through history itself, compressed into liquid form, carrying the weight of everything that has ever sunk and settled and been forgotten. Break the surface. Feel the air. It is night. The sky above is clear in a way that modern eyes rarely experience, not the washed-out grey of cities, not the hazy approximation of suburbs, but the full, unfiltered canopy of the ancient sky, the one your ancestors knew. The Milky Way is not a faint smudge here. It is a river of light so dense it casts shadows on the ground. Thousands of stars press against the darkness like dust caught in a beam of light, each one a sun, each sun older than anything your species has ever built or imagined or dreamed. The stars do not care that you're watching them. They were here before you. They will be here long after the last stone you ever raised has been ground back into sand by the patient fingers of the wind. Now, look down. The land beneath you stretches flat and dark toward a horizon you cannot quite see. This is the Anatolian Plateau, southeastern Turkey, though those names mean nothing yet. They will not exist for thousands of years. The grass here is short and coarse, beaten, low by wind that sweeps across the limestone ridges without obstruction. There are no cities, no roads, no fences or walls or fields of cultivated grain. The landscape is raw and unpetitioned, belonging to itself in a way that no modern terrain does. The air smells of cold stone and dry earth and something faintly mineral like the inside of a cave that has been sealed for centuries and only just cracked open. Somewhere in the distance a fire burns, not a wildfire, but something smaller and more deliberate. A cluster of flames held inside a ring of stones tended by hands that understand its temperament. The light it casts is orange and unsteady, flickering against the dark like a heartbeat made visible. This is what silence sounded like before the modern world filled it. Not true silence. The earth is never truly silent. There is the wind threading through the grass with a low, continuous exhalation that rises and falls in rhythms older than language. There is the creak and settle of cooling stone as the day's heat radiates back into the sky. There is the distant call of something, a bird, an animal, a voice too far away to identify, too present to ignore. And beneath all of it, beneath the wind and the stone and the living things, there is the deeper sound, the one you feel, rather than hear the slow, tectonic murmur of the planet itself turning on its axis, pulling its crust across the mantle, grinding the bones of mountains into the dust that will become the soil, that will feed the forests that will one day grow and die, and become the coal that will power the machines, that will light the cities, that will blot out the very stars now burning above your head. Geology is patience made visible. Erosion is time thinking. Feel the ground beneath you. It is cold. The limestone is 300 million years old, formed from the compressed bodies of sea creatures that lived in a shallow ocean that no longer exists on a continent that no longer holds its shape. Everything you stand on was once alive. Everything beneath your feet was once the floor of a vanished sea. The stone remembers this in its chemistry, if not its consciousness, carrying the calcium of ancient shells, the carbon of ancient breath, locked into crystal structures that will outlast every monument ever built upon them. And yet on this ridge in this darkness, beneath these impossible stars, something is about to happen that the stone itself could not have predicted. Hands that have spent generations chipping flint and scraping hide are about to carve intention into the earth on a scale that will not be matched for 7,000 years. They are about to raise pillars weighing 20 tons and align them to constellations that will not be named for millennia, and cover them with images of animals and symbols whose meanings will be lost before writing is invented to preserve them. They are about to build the first cathedral, and then they are going to bury it. But that story comes later. For now there is only the dark, the wind, the cold stone, and the stars wheeling slowly overhead in patterns that someone somewhere is beginning to memorize, not with instruments, not with written charts, but with eyes, with patience, with the quiet, relentless attention of a species that has learned to read the sky the way the blind learn to read, with their fingers, through touch, through repetition, through a devotion so deep it becomes indistinguishable from love. The night is old. The atmosphere holds everything that has ever been spoken into it. Nothing is truly lost. It is only dispersed. And dispersal is just another word for patience. The evidence does not arrive all at once. It accumulates the way sediment accumulates slowly, quietly, one grain at a time, until the weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. For more than a century, archaeologists have been pulling fragments from the earth, brushing dust from surfaces that have not seen light in thousands of years, cataloguing stones and bones and broken pottery with the careful patience of people who understand that the past does not reveal itself to those who rush. And what they have found, piece by piece, site by site, continent by continent, is a record that does not behave the way it should. The timeline we were taught, the neat upward arc from primitive to advanced, from cave paintings to cathedrals to computers, that timeline has cracks in it, and the cracks are getting wider. Start with the stones, At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, limestone pillars weighing between 10 and 20 tons stand arranged in concentric circles on a hilltop that overlooks the plains, where agriculture would later be born. Radiocarbon dating places their construction at approximately 9,600 BCE, 11,600 years ago, more than 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 5,000 years before anyone on Earth is known to have written a single word. The people who raised these pillars were hunter-gatherers. They had no farms, no pottery, no permanent settlements, no domesticated animals beyond the dog. According to everything we thought we knew about the progression of human civilization, they should have been living in temporary camps and following game herds and using stone tools for simple tasks. Instead, they built a temple complex covered in intricate carvings of foxes, vultures, snakes, scorpions, and abstract symbols whose meanings remain unknown, aligned to stellar configurations that would not be formally mapped for millennia. The craftsmanship is extraordinary: precise angles, smooth surfaces, deliberate composition. This is not the work of people experimenting. This is the work of people who already knew. Move south and east to the Nile Valley, where the Great Pyramid of Giza has been measured and analysed more thoroughly than any structure in human history, and yet its precision continues to unsettle the engineers who study it. Approximately 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, with granite blocks in the King's Chamber exceeding 80 tons. The base covers 13 acres and is levelled to within less than an inch across its entire expanse, a tolerance that would challenge modern construction equipment operating with laser-guided instruments. The sides align to the cardinal directions with an error of less than 1/15 of a single degree, oriented not to magnetic north, which shifts over time, but to true north, calculated through astronomical observation with a patience and accuracy that presupposes generations of continuous sky-watching. And here is the detail that troubles the conventional narrative most deeply. The pyramid appears in the 4th dynasty early in Egyptian history, and represents a level of engineering that the Egyptians themselves never surpassed. Later pyramids are smaller, less precise, more prone to collapse. If this were a technology gradually refined over centuries, we would expect the opposite: crude early attempts giving way to sophisticated later works. Instead, we see perfection at the beginning, followed by decline. The evidence runs backward, across the Mediterranean to Lebanon to the Bekaa Valley, where the ancient platform of Baalbek holds 3 stones known as the trilithon, each measuring approximately 60 feet long, 14 feet high and 12 feet thick, each weighing an estimated 800 tons. They sit perfectly fitted together, forming a single course in the western wall of a temple platform positioned 20 feet above ground level, with no mortar binding them and no gaps separating them. 800 tons is roughly the weight of 3 fully loaded 747 aircraft. Modern cranes designed for heavy lifting typically max out around 200 to 300 tons, and they require carefully prepared ground hydraulic stabilization and teams of engineers calculating load distribution to the decimal point. Yet someone quarried these stones from a site a quarter-mile away, transported them across uneven terrain, lifted them 20 feet into the air, and placed them with a precision that still holds firm after thousands of years of earthquakes and weathering and war. In the quarry itself, still attached to the bedrock, lies a block estimated at 1,650 tons, shaped its edges, defined its surfaces, smoothed, and then abandoned as if the builders stopped mid-project and never returned. Now, cross an ocean. In the Andes at Sacsayhuaman overlooking Cusco, limestone blocks weighing up to 200 tons are shaped into polygonal forms, with as many as 12 angles per stone interlocking like 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzles fitted so tightly that a knife blade cannot slide between them. No mortar, no cement, just stone pressed against stone, with a tolerance measured in fractions of a millimetre, built by a civilization that had no iron tools and no wheels. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, andesite blocks, one of the hardest stones on Earth, are cut with laser-straight edges and perfectly uniform right angles, their H-shaped grooves identical in dimension across multiple stones, their surfaces polished smooth as glass. In India, the Kailasa temple was carved downward from a mountainside, removing an estimated 400,000 tons of rock to create a freestanding structure with intricate sculptures and pillared halls and multi-story pavilions all hewn from a single continuous rock face, with no major structural failures and no obvious corrections. On Easter Island, 80-ton statues were transported miles across barren landscape by a population with no trees, no wheels, and no draft animals, using techniques that modern engineers are still struggling to reconstruct. These are not myths. These are measurements. These are GPS coordinates and laser scans and radiocarbon dates and satellite images. They are stones you can touch, and walls you can run your hand along, and joints you can test with a blade. The evidence is not hidden. It is standing in daylight on every continent, carved into mountains and raised on plateaus and aligned with the heavens, waiting with the patience of stone for someone to ask the question that the data has been quietly insisting upon for decades. Not how did ancient people build such things with simple tools and endless labour. That question has been asked, and its answers grow thinner with each new discovery. The deeper question, the one the evidence keeps circling back to like water finding its level, is this: why does the oldest work look like the best work? Why does knowledge appear not gradually, not through trial and error, but suddenly completely as if remembered rather than invented? The stones do not answer. They simply remain heavier than history, more precise than accident, and older than the stories we tell about them. There is a moment in every investigation when the evidence stops confirming what you expected and begins suggesting something else entirely. It does not happen dramatically. It happens the way a crack appears in glass, not with a shatter, but with a quiet, spreading line that changes the structural integrity of everything around it. You do not notice it at first. You continue reading the data, measuring the stones, cataloguing the artifacts, trusting the framework that has organized your understanding for as long as you can remember. And then one morning you look at the numbers again and realize that the framework no longer holds. The anomaly is not a single discovery. It is the accumulation of discoveries that should not exist together, a pattern of exceptions so consistent that it stops being exceptional and starts being the rule. Consider what the conventional timeline asks you to accept. It asks you to believe that hunter-gatherers with no permanent settlements, no metallurgy, no written language, and no known system of mathematics organized the labor of hundreds of people to quarry, transport, and raise 20-ton limestone pillars into precise astronomical alignment at Göbekli Tepe, and then deliberately buried the entire complex under thousands of tons of earth and walked away. It asks you to believe that the most precise, most massive, most perfectly aligned pyramid in Egypt was also the first one built at the very beginning of the tradition, rather than at its peak, and that every pyramid constructed afterward was smaller, cruder, and more prone to collapse. It asks you to believe that cultures separated by oceans and millennia with no known contact between them independently arrived at the same mathematical constants, the same astronomical obsessions, the same division of the circle into 360 degrees, the same alignment of monuments to cardinal directions and specific stellar configurations, and the same mythological claim that their knowledge was not invented but inherited from a prior age destroyed by flood. Any one of these facts taken in isolation can be explained away. Göbekli Tepe was a remarkable achievement by a remarkably determined group of people. The Great Pyramid represents the concentrated genius of a wealthy dynasty. Baalbek's trilithon was an ambitious Roman engineering project. The polygonal walls of the Andes were the product of patient craftsmanship refined over generations. The Maya developed their astronomical tables independently through centuries of careful observation. Each anomaly has its own explanation, its own footnote, its own reassuring context. But when you line them up, when you place Göbekli Tepe next to Giza, next to Baalbek, next to Sacsayhuaman, next to Puma Punku, next to Mohenjo-Daro, next to Chichen Itza, next to Easter Island, the footnotes begin to sound like the same footnote repeated in different languages, and the reassurance begins to feel less like confidence and more like habit. The anomaly is not the stones. The anomaly is the pattern. Across every continent and cultures that could not have communicated with one another, this same set of principles appears at the very beginning of each civilization's architectural record. Monumental stone construction, using blocks far larger than necessary for simple building precision cutting and fitting that exceeds what the known tools of the period should have been capable of producing alignment to true north and to specific astronomical events, such as solstices, equinoxes, and the rising positions of key stars' seismic engineering, designed to withstand earthquakes through interlocking polygonal geometry, rather than rigid rectangular blocks and hydraulic systems that manage water with a sophistication that presupposes deep understanding of fluid dynamics, gradient calculation, and environmental planning. These are not random coincidences. These are design principles, and they appear fully formed, as if the builders arrived at each site already knowing what they intended to create and already possessing the knowledge required to execute it. This is the crack in the glass. Knowledge is supposed to evolve. It is supposed to begin with crude attempts and gradually improve through experimentation, failure, and refinement. That is how technology works in every documented case we can observe. The first automobiles were slow and unreliable. The first computers filled entire rooms and could barely perform calculations that a modern phone handles in microseconds. The first bridges collapsed. The first rockets exploded. Progress is messy and iterative and littered with the wreckage of failed prototypes. And yet when we look at the oldest monumental architecture on Earth, the wreckage is missing. The failed prototypes do not exist. The experimental phase, the period of learning by doing the generations of crude attempts that should precede any sophisticated construction tradition, they are simply not there. What we find instead is mastery appearing at the beginning as if the learning had already been done somewhere else, at some other time in some context that has since been erased from the record. The Indus Valley civilization offers perhaps the most striking example. When its cities appear in the archaeological record around 2600 BCE, they do not appear as rough settlements gradually acquiring infrastructure. They appear as fully planned urban centres, with grid-aligned streets, standardized brick dimensions following precise mathematical ratios, covered sewage systems with inspection chambers and soak pits, public bathing complexes with waterproof floors, and separate channels for clean and wastewater, a level of municipal engineering that Europe would not achieve for another 4,000 years. Where are the failed cities? Where are these settlements with crooked streets and collapsing drains and haphazard layouts that should have preceded this level of organisation? They should exist in the archaeological record. They do not. The civilization appears to arrive already knowing how to build a city as if the blueprint existed before the first brick was fired. The same dissonance echoes in Sumer, where cuneiform writing appears not as simple pictograms scratched into clay by farmers learning to track grain, but as a fully functional system capable of recording complex administrative details, trade agreements, astronomical observations, and religious hymns from the very beginning. There is no evidence of a long experimental phase, no slow evolution from simple marks to complex grammar. Writing in Sumer arrives complete, as if someone already knew what a writing system needed to do and simply executed it. The Sumerians used a base 60 mathematical system, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, a system that is not intuitive for creatures with 10 fingers, but is extraordinarily convenient for dividing circles and calculating celestial cycles. Why would an early agricultural society choose a number system optimized for astronomical measurement, unless they were already measuring the sky with the intent to encode what they found? The anomaly whispers the same question from every corner of the ancient world. It does not shout, it does not demand, it simply persists the way a crack persists in glass, quiet, structural, and impossible to unsee once you have noticed it. The evidence does not fit the story we have been telling, and when the evidence and the story disagree, it is not the evidence that needs to change. There is something more unsettling than finding evidence that does not fit. It is finding the place where evidence should exist and discovering nothing at all. Silence in the archaeological record is not the same as absence. Absence means something was never there. Silence means something was there and has been erased by water, by time, by the slow grinding patience of geology, or by catastrophe so total that it left no monument standing, no text legible, no city above the waterline. The ancient world is full of noise stones and carvings and clay tablets and painted walls shouting across millennia about kings and gods and harvests and wars. But beneath that noise, if you listen carefully, there is a deeper layer where the record simply stops. Not because nothing happened, but because whatever happened left no surface for memory to cling to. The silence is not empty. It is full of everything that drowned. Consider what the ocean has taken. 12,800 years ago, at the onset of the Younger Dryas, sea levels stood approximately 400 feet lower than they do today. That's not a minor fluctuation. That is a different planet. Coastlines extended miles beyond their current positions. The English Channel was a grassy plain. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Sunda Shelf, connecting Southeast Asia to Indonesia and Borneo, was dry land, the subcontinent-sized territory now completely submerged. Australia was connected to New Guinea. India's western coast extended far into what is now the Arabian Sea. The Mediterranean shoreline was radically different, with islands larger and land bridges intact that have since vanished beneath the waves. Every civilization that existed before the ice melted, every settlement built along those ancient coasts, every port and fishing village and temple and city that may have stood where the continental shelves now lie hidden, under hundreds of feet of salt water, all of it is gone, not destroyed in the way a fire destroys a building leaving ash and foundation, gone in the way the ocean makes things gone slowly completely, with a patience that turns stone to sand and wood to nothing and memory to myth. This is the silence. It is not a gap in the record. It is a flood through the record, washing away precisely the evidence that would tell us what existed before the waters rose. And it is not a small gap. The coastal zones of the ancient world, the areas where human populations have always concentrated, where rivers meet the sea, where trade routes converge, where food is abundant and travel is easy, those zones are exactly the zones that were inundated when the ice sheets collapsed and the ocean swelled. If an advanced maritime civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, it would have built where every maritime civilization builds on the coast, and the coast is exactly what we lost. We're studying the survivors who fled to higher ground and calling them the beginning, when they may have been the remnants of something we can no longer see. Sonar surveys have begun to pierce this silence, and what they find is troubling. Off the coast of western India in the Gulf of Cambay, sonar mapping has revealed geometric formations on the seafloor, rectilinear structures, right angles, what appear to be walls and foundations resting beneath 130 feet of water in an area that was dry land before the post-glacial flooding. Off the southern coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Formation presents terraced stone surfaces, sharp edges, and what some researchers interpret as carved steps and platforms submerged in waters that were above sea level during the last ice age. In the eastern Mediterranean, submerged ruins dot the sea floor off the coasts of Greece, Egypt and Lebanon harbours, and breakwaters, and building foundations now resting beneath waves that rose slowly enough for the inhabitants to abandon them, but too quickly for the structures to be preserved in any historical record. These are not definitive proof of lost civilizations. They are whispers from beneath the waterline, suggestions that the silence is not as silent as we assumed. But the ocean is not the only thing that erases. The Sahara erases too. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. Satellite imaging has revealed vast river systems beneath the sand channels carved into bedrock by flowing water, wide enough and deep enough to have supported large populations along their banks. Lake Chad, now a shrinking remnant in the southern Sahara, was once an inland sea larger than the Caspian, surrounded by grasslands and forests, and almost certainly by human settlements whose traces now lie beneath hundreds of feet of wind-deposited sand. The Sahara did not become a desert overnight. It dried slowly over millennia as the climate shifted and the monsoon patterns that had sustained its rivers and lakes migrated south. But slowly in geological terms is still fast enough to bury everything. The sand is patient. The sand does not need to destroy. It only needs to cover, and given enough time it covers everything. Walls, roads, fields, tombs, entire cities, pressing them into the earth with a weight that is gentle and absolute and very nearly permanent. The same silence extends to organic materials. Wood rots, leather decays, textiles dissolve, bone powders, The technology is most likely to have been used by a sophisticated pre-glacial civilization, shipbuilding, textile production, astronomical instruments made from wood or bone or sinew, written records on bark or hide or paper, are precisely the technologies that leave no trace in the archaeological record after 10,000 years of exposure to water heat, microbial activity and chemical dissolution. We find the stones because stones survive. We find the megaliths because megaliths are too heavy to wash away and too dense to rot. But the absence of perishable evidence does not mean the absence of perishable technology. It means the record is biased toward what endures and silent about everything else. We are reading a library from which every page made of anything softer than rock has been dissolved by time, and we are concluding that the library only ever contained stone tablets. This is the trap of the silence. It does not announce itself. It does not leave a marker that says here is where the record was lost. It simply presents an empty space and allows us to mistake that emptiness for the full story. We look at the archaeological record and see civilization beginning in Sumer in Egypt around 5,000 years ago, and we call that the beginning because that is where our evidence begins. But the beginning of evidence is not the same as the beginning of events. The map is not the territory, the record is not the past. And the silence between what we can prove and what actually happened is vast enough to hold everything we have ever failed to imagine, every city that drowned, every library that rotted, every coastline that vanished beneath 400 feet of cold, dark, indifferent water. The silence is not nothing. The silence is the sound of everything we lost before we learned to listen. Close your eyes. Not to sleep, not yet, but to see something that no longer exists in any form you can visit or photograph or touch. See it the way you see a place described in a letter from someone who loved it, and is now gone through the texture of their attention, through the weight of what they chose to remember. Imagine a world before the flood, not the world of mythology, not the simplified world of Sunday school illustrations with wooden arcs and paired animals walking up a ramp, but the actual physical world as it existed 14,000 years ago, when the ice sheets were still intact and the oceans were 400 feet lower, and the continents wore a different face. Imagine standing on a coastline that no longer exists, looking out at a horizon that is now the middle of the sea, and behind you stretches a civilization that we have no name for because no one survived it completely enough to tell us what it was called. This is the forgotten epoch. Not a single empire, but a way of being, long, slow accumulation of knowledge, gathered by people who watched the sky for generations and the earth for longer, who learned to read the rhythms of rivers and tides and seasons and stars with a patience that our accelerated world can barely comprehend. They did not build the way we build with steel and concrete, and the arrogant assumption that energy will always be abundant and materials will always be cheap. They built with stone because they understood that stone endures. They built with geometry because they understood that mathematics is the only language that does not decay. They aligned their structures to the heavens because they understood that the stars are the only clock that keeps time across millennia, the only reference frame stable enough to encode information that must survive longer than any human institution or written language or living memory. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke or what songs they sang or what stories they told their children before sleep. We know them only through their echoes, through the structures that the survivors built afterward, through the myths that hardened into scripture, through the astronomical alignments and mathematical constants, and engineering principles that appear suddenly and fully formed in civilizations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, as if each one were working from the same half-remembered blueprint. The Egyptians called the source of their knowledge Zep Tepi, the first time and age when gods walked the earth and established the principles that humans would later struggle to maintain. The Sumerians spoke of Oans, a being who emerged from the sea to teach them writing, mathematics, and law. The people of the Andes remembered Viracocha, who appeared after a great flood to reteach civilization to the survivors. The Maya credited Kukulkan with bringing them astronomy and the calendar. In India, Manu preserved the knowledge of the world through the deluge by building a vessel and carrying the seeds of everything that mattered across the waters of destruction to the shore of a new beginning. Different names, different continents, different centuries, but the same architecture of memory. A golden age existed before the catastrophe. Knowledge was abundant, sophisticated, integrated with the natural world in ways that later civilizations could only approximate. Then something happened, a flood, a fire, a collapse so total that the world had to begin again from fragments. And the people who survived carried what they could not in books or hard drives, or filing cabinets, but in their bodies, in their rituals, in the songs they taught their children, in the alignments they carved into stone so that even if the words were forgotten, the geometry would remain pointing silently at the stars that had guided their ancestors through the long centuries before the water rose and the sky turned dark and the old world drowned beneath the weight of its own melting ice. Picture that world. Picture the coastal cities, not crude settlements of mud and thatch, but planned communities built where rivers met the sea, oriented to the cardinal directions, engineered to manage the flow of water and waste. With the same precision we see later in Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, picture harbours where boats departed for trading partners along coastlines that are now submerged continental shelves carrying goods and knowledge and navigational techniques refined over generations of open water travel. Picture observatories, not the domed telescopic buildings of the modern era, but stone platforms aligned to the solstices and equinoxes and the rising points of key stars staffed by watchers who recorded the movements of Venus and Jupiter and the slow wobble of the Earth's axis across cycles so long that no single human lifetime could contain them. Picture libraries not of paper or clay, but of carved stone and memorized verse knowledge, encoded in forms designed to survive the impermanence of organic materials embedded in myth and monument, and the sacred geometry of temple floors. We cannot prove this world existed. That is the honest truth, and honesty matters even when the imagination aches to fill the silence with certainty. The ocean has taken the direct evidence. The sand has buried what the ocean did not reach. The millennia have dissolved everything made of anything softer than rock. What we have instead are echoes persistent, consistent, geographically distributed echoes that resonate across cultures and centuries with a specificity that pure coincidence struggles to explain. We have Göbekli Tepe, where hunter-gatherers who should not have possessed such knowledge raised astronomically aligned megaliths 7,000 years before the pyramids and then buried them under the earth, as if sealing a time capsule for a future that might need to remember. We have the Great Pyramid appearing at the beginning of Egyptian architecture rather than its culmination, built with a precision that subsequent generations could not match. We have Baalbek's impossible stones and the Andes earthquake-proof walls, and the Indus Valley's immaculate cities and the Maya's Venus tables accurate to within hours over 5 centuries of observation. None of this constitutes proof in the way a laboratory experiment constitutes proof, but all of it constitutes a pattern, and patterns are how the universe communicates with those patient enough to notice. The forgotten epoch does not need us to believe in it. It does not need our validation or our academic consensus or our permission to have existed. It needs only what it has always had: the stones that survived the myths that endured, the alignments that still point at the same stars they pointed at 12,000 years ago, when the ice began to crack and the water began to rise and the long silence began. The forgotten epoch is not a theory. It is a question shaped like an absence, an outline drawn by everything that surrounds it, the way you can see the shape of a river that has dried by tracing the trees that still grow along its vanished banks. The water is gone, the shape remains, and the shape is telling us something if only we are quiet enough and patient enough and humble enough to listen. The earth breathes, not the way you breathe, not with lungs, not with rhythm you can count, but in cycles so vast they make human history look like a single exhale in a lifetime that spans billions of years. Ice advances and retreats across continents in pulses that last tens of thousands of years. Oceans rise and fall like the chest of something sleeping. Mountains push upward through tectonic pressure and are ground back down by rain and wind and the patient chemistry of dissolution, only to rise again when the plates shift and the magma finds a new seam to follow toward the surface. The planet is not static. It is not a stage upon which life performs. It is alive in its own slow mineral way, cycling through states of warmth and cold growth, and contraction, accumulation, and release. And every so often, not often by human standards, but often enough by geological ones. It exhales sharply, and when it does, everything on its surface rearranges. The Younger Dryas was one of those exhalations. Around 12,800 years ago, something struck the northern hemisphere, perhaps a fragmenting comet, perhaps a cluster of debris from a disintegrating asteroid, and the impact, whether it hit the ice sheets directly or exploded in the atmosphere above them, triggered a cascade of consequences so rapid and so severe that the world before the event and the world after it were for all practical purposes different planets. The evidence is written in ice cores pulled from the Greenland ice sheet, thin layers of iridium and platinum elements rare on Earth's surface, but common in extraterrestrial objects deposited at precisely the same stratigraphic level across multiple drilling sites. It is written in microscopic nanodiamonds found in sediment layers across North America, Europe, and the Middle East diamonds that can only form under conditions of extreme heat and pressure, the kind produced by cosmic impact. It is written in impact spherules, tiny beads of melted rock scattered across the northern hemisphere like frozen rain, and in a continent-spanning layer of black carbon, the residue of wildfires so massive they consumed forests across millions of square miles in what must have been weeks or even days. The climate responded with a violence that defies comfortable imagination. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere plunged by as much as 14 degrees Fahrenheit within a single human generation. Forests that had been advancing northward as the previous ice age waned suddenly died back, replaced by tundra and Arctic wildflowers, including Dryas octopetala, the small white flower for which the entire period is named, whose pollen appears abruptly in the fossil record like a signature written in cold. The ice sheets, which had been slowly retreating for thousands of years, advanced again. Glacial lakes that had formed behind the melting ice burst their boundaries, as the new cold destabilized the dams of ice and moraine that contained them, sending walls of fresh water across continents with a force that carved new river valleys in hours and deposited boulders the size of houses hundreds of miles from their points of origin. And then, approximately 11,600 years ago, the cold reversed itself, almost as suddenly as it had begun, and the ice began to melt again this time, rapidly, catastrophically releasing the accumulated water of millennia into oceans that rose by hundreds of feet over the course of centuries, drowning every coastline on Earth, and reshaping the world's geography into something close to what we recognize today. This was not the end. That is the crucial thing to understand. The Younger Dryas was not an extinction event in the way that the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs was an extinction event. Life continued. Humans survived, scattered, traumatized, stripped of whatever infrastructure and accumulated knowledge their coastal settlements had contained, but alive. The megafauna were less fortunate. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other large species that had thrived for millions of years vanished in what amounts to a geological eye blink, their disappearance coinciding precisely with the impact layer and the onset of the cold. But humans smaller, more adaptable, more capable of cooperation and improvisation made it through. They carried fire, they carried language, they carried memory. And what they remembered they began almost immediately to rebuild. This is what makes the Younger Dryas not merely a catastrophe, but a Rosetta word that implies not just destruction, but the clearing of a surface upon which something new or something old can be written again. The Earth did not end, it recalibrated. The ice exhaled and the water rose and the continents changed shape and the megafauna died, and the human population contracted to scattered bands of survivors huddled around fires on high ground, watching the floodwaters recede from valleys that had been dry land within their grandparents' memory. And when the water settled and the climate stabilized and the new coastlines hardened into permanence, those survivors did something remarkable. They did not build crude shelters and spend the next several thousand years slowly rediscovering the basics of construction and agriculture and astronomy. They built Göbekli Tepe. They raised 20-ton pillars in precise astronomical alignment. They carved elaborate iconography into limestone surfaces with tools that should not have been capable of such detail. They organized labor on a monumental scale, without cities, without agriculture, without any of the institutional infrastructure that we consider prerequisite for large-scale cooperative construction. And then they buried it, as if closing a chapter, as if sealing a memory into the earth for safekeeping. The reset did not erase knowledge, it dispersed it. Like seeds scattered by a violent wind, the fragments of whatever was known before the cataclysm landed in different soils across the world and germinated at different rates, producing civilizations that looked different on the surface, but shared the same deep-root structure, the same astronomical obsessions, the same mathematical constants, the same architectural principles, the same mythological insistence that the knowledge they carried was not new, but recovered, not invented, but remembered from a time before the waters rose. Egypt remembered it as Zep Tepi. Sumer remembered it through Wans. The Andes remembered it through Viracocha. The Maya remembered it through Kukulkan. Each culture gave the memory a different face, a different name, a different story, but the underlying structure was identical once we knew more. Then the world broke. Then we rebuilt from what we could save. The earth breathes, and when it exhales, civilizations fall. But breath implies rhythm. Rhythm implies repetition, and repetition implies that what has happened before will happen again, not identically, not predictably, but inevitably the way winter follows autumn, the way the tide withdraws before it returns, the way the planet cools and warms and cools again, in cycles that no human institution has ever been old enough to witness in full. The reset was not punishment. It was not divine judgment. It was geology, vast, impersonal, and utterly indifferent to the smallness of human plans. The earth does not destroy civilizations out of malice. It simply breathes, and we happen to be living on its skin. The question is not whether it will breathe again. The question is whether we will remember this time what happened the last time it exhaled. The past does not stay where we put it. We imagine history as something behind us, a road, already travelled, a book, already read, its pages sealed and its events concluded. But that is not how the past behaves. The past leaks. It seeps forward through cracks in the present like groundwater, finding its way through limestone dissolving channels we cannot see shaping the surface from below. You carry the past in your bones, literally chemically, in the calcium and phosphorus that were cycled through soil and water and plant and animal before they became the scaffolding of your skeleton. You carry it in your DNA in sequences of genetic code that were shaped by pressures and environments and catastrophes that occurred thousands of generations before your birth, each one leaving its mark in the architecture of your cells. You carry it in your language in words whose etymologies trace back through centuries of drift and migration, and conquest to roots so ancient that no living speaker remembers their original meaning. The past is not behind you, it is inside you, and it echoes. The echoes are everywhere once you learn to hear them. They are in the way we build. The Romans did not invent the arch, they inherited it from the Etruscans, who may have inherited it from older traditions whose origins are unclear. The Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe, with their soaring vaulted ceilings and their windows aligned to catch the light of the equinox sun, are descendants of architectural principles that trace backward through Romanesque churches and Byzantine basilicas and Roman temples to the ancient world's obsession with sacred geometry and celestial alignment. When a modern architect orients a building to true north, they are performing, whether they know it or not, the same act that the builders of the Great Pyramid performed 5,000 years ago, which may itself have been a repetition of something performed by builders whose names and cities were drowned beneath 400 feet of ocean before the first pharaoh was born. The act persists, the knowledge flows forward, the echo carries. They are in the way we measure time. Every time you glance at a clock and read 60 seconds, in a minute 60 minutes, in an hour, you're using a base 60 mathematical system invented or remembered by the Sumerians more than 5,000 years ago. Every time you divide a circle into 360 degrees, you're applying a framework designed not for counting sheep or measuring fields, but for tracking the movements of stars across the sky. A framework so precisely suited to astronomical calculation that no subsequent civilization has found reason to replace it. The Sumerians did not choose base 60 because it was simple. They chose it because it was powerful, divisible by more factors than any smaller number, elegant, for calculating celestial cycles, perfect for encoding the kind of knowledge that requires precision across very long periods of time. And we kept it not because we decided to, but because it worked so well that abandoning it never occurred to us. The echo of a 5,000-year-old mathematical decision still structures every moment of your waking life, every appointment you keep, every flight you catch, every second that ticks off the clock on your wall. They're in the way we tell stories. The flood myth is not one story. It is hundreds of stories scattered across every inhabited continent, told by cultures that had no contact with one another, each one preserving the same essential structure: a world destroyed by water, a small number of survivors, the preservation of knowledge or seed or sacred lineage through the catastrophe, and the slow rebuilding of civilization from the wreckage. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells it. The Hebrew Bible tells it. The Puranas of India tell it. The Popol Vuh of the Maya tells it. The oral traditions of the Hopi and the Aboriginal Australians and the peoples of Polynesia and West Africa and Southeast Asia tell it, each in their own language, with their own symbols, but with a consistency of theme and structure that cannot be explained by coincidence alone. These stories are not allegories invented to teach moral lessons. They are memories compressed, distorted by millennia of oral transmission wrapped in the protective casing of myth and ritual to ensure their survival across generations that would not have understood them if they had been told as plain history. The echo of a real event reverberating through the narrative traditions of every culture on Earth, still audible 12,000 years after the waters rose. They are in the way we worship. The alignment of churches to the east toward the rising sun is not a Christian invention. It is an echo of solar worship traditions that predate Christianity by millennia, rooted in the same impulse that aligned Göbekli Tepe's enclosures to specific stellar configurations and oriented the Great Pyramid's passages toward Orion and Sirius, and positioned Stonehenge's heelstone to catch the first light of the summer solstice. The impulse to orient sacred space toward celestial events is so deep, so widespread, and so persistent across cultures and centuries that it cannot be attributed to any single tradition or theology. It is something older, an echo of the foundational insight that the sky is not merely beautiful, but meaningful, that the movements of stars and planets encode information about cycles and seasons and time itself, and that human structures should be aligned with those movements, not for decoration but for orientation in the deepest sense of the word, meaning to know where you are in space and time by reading the language of the heavens. They are in your body. When you feel the pull of the ocean, when the sound of waves against a shore produces in you a calm that no pharmaceutical can replicate, you are responding to an echo written into your nervous system by ancestors who lived along coastlines for thousands of generations, coastlines that no longer exist, swallowed by the same rising waters that erased the settlements built upon them. When you look up at the night sky and feel something that is not quite awe and not quite loneliness, but something in between a recognition, a sense of being seen by something vast and old and indifferent, you're feeling the echo of 10,000 years of sky watching, encoded not in your conscious memory but in the deep architecture of your brain, in neural pathways shaped by the survival advantage of paying attention to the stars. Your ancestors who watched the sky lived. They predicted seasons, anticipated floods, navigated oceans, and planted crops at the right time. Those who did not watch the sky perished more often, reproduced less successfully, and left fewer descendants. You are the inheritor of the watchers. The echo is in your attention in the way your eyes are drawn upward on clear nights in the quiet awe that settles over you when the stars are bright enough to remind you of something you have never consciously known but have always somehow recognized. The past is not behind you. It is the ground you walk on, the air. You breathe the mathematics you use to measure your days, the stories you tell your children before they fall asleep, the direction your churches face, the calm you feel beside the sea. It echoes through everything, and the oldest echoes, the ones that have travelled the farthest through the most distortion across the most millennia, are still the clearest, because they were carved into the most durable materials the ancient world could find: stone, sky number, and myth. Everything else has decayed. The echoes remain humming just below the threshold of conscious hearing, waiting for someone quiet enough to notice. that the present is not as new as it pretends to be. There is a moment when you've been looking at something for a very long time, when the individual pieces stop being individual and the whole becomes visible. It is the moment a constellation appears not because the stars have moved, but because your mind has finally connected them. The stars were always there, scattered across the dark in what seemed like randomness, and then suddenly they are not random at all. They are a shape, a figure, a story drawn in light across the blackness, and you wonder how you ever looked at that patch of sky without seeing it. That's what happens when you lay the evidence of the ancient world side by side, not grouped by continent, not sorted by date, not filed into the neat categories of conventional archaeology, but arranged by principle, by function, by the underlying logic of what was built and why. The individual sites stop being exceptions. They become a pattern, and the pattern, once you see it, is impossible to unsee. Begin with alignment. Göbekli Tepe's enclosures align to the constellation Cygnus as it appeared on the horizon around 10,000 BCE. The three pyramids of Giza align to the belt stars of Orion. Angkor Wat in Cambodia mirrors the constellation Draco as it appeared at the spring equinox around 10,500 BCE. Stonehenge aligns to the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. Newgrange in Ireland channels the light of the winter solstice sunrise through a narrow roof box and down a 60-foot passage to illuminate an inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes once a year. Chichen Itza's El Castillo produces a shadow serpent on the equinox. A caracol's windows track the extreme positions of Venus. The Kalasasaya temple at Tiwanaku aligns to solstice sunrises and sunsets with a precision that some researchers argue encodes the obliquity of Earth's axis at the time of construction. These are not decorative choices. These are not accidents of orientation. These are deliberate, calculated, precise encodings of astronomical knowledge into architectural form executed by cultures on every inhabited continent, separated by oceans and millennia, with no documented contact between them. The pattern is not that ancient people were interested in the sky. The pattern is that they encoded the same specific astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, precession, the rising and setting of particular stars into their most sacred and permanent structures, as if they were all following the same curriculum. Now add mathematics. The base 60 system of Sumer appears in Babylon in the astronomical calculations of the Maya, in the geometric proportions of Egyptian temple design, in the division of the sky into 12 houses of 30 degrees each, a framework that persists unchanged in modern astrology navigation and timekeeping. The golden ratio appears in the proportions of the Great Pyramid, in the spiral layout of Maya cities, in the sacred geometry of Hindu temple plans described in the Vastu Shastra, in the design of Greek temples that were supposedly the independent invention of a culture that emerged thousands of years later and thousands of miles away. The number 72, the number of years it takes for the precession of the equinoxes to shift by 1 degree, appears in the mythology and sacred architecture of Egypt, India, China, Scandinavia and Mesoamerica, embedded in the counts of gods, the dimensions of temples, the durations of mythological ages and the structure of sacred calendars. This is not a number that an agricultural society stumbles upon by accident. This is a number that requires centuries of continuous astronomical observation to derive. And yet, it appears in cultures that, according to the conventional timeline, invented astronomy independently and could not possibly have shared data. Now add engineering. Polygonal interlocking masonry stones, cut into irregular shapes, with multiple contact faces fitted together without mortar, in configurations that distribute seismic stress across many angles, rather than concentrating it along straight edges, appears in Peru, in Bolivia, in Easter Island, in the foundations of Greek and Italian structures, in the megalithic walls of Japan, and in the Cyclopean masonry of pre-Roman Mediterranean sites. These cultures did not share architects. They did not attend the same engineering schools. They did not read each other's construction manuals. And yet they arrived at the same solution to the same problem: how to build structures that survive earthquakes, using the same technique, a technique that is not intuitive, that requires sophisticated understanding of how stress propagates through solid materials, and that is so effective that walls built with this method thousands of years ago remain standing while modern buildings constructed nearby have collapsed into rubble. The same is true of hydraulic engineering. The Indus Valley's covered sewage systems, the Maya's reservoir and filtration networks, the Aztec chinampas, the Andean waru-waru fields. The Roman aqueducts, each developed in isolation, each solving the same fundamental problem of water management with techniques that presuppose the same underlying understanding of fluid dynamics, gradient calculation, and environmental integration. The conventional explanation for all of this is independent invention. The idea that humans, when faced with similar environments and similar challenges, will converge on similar solutions through parallel processes of trial and error. And for simple technologies, this explanation is persuasive. Pottery appears independently in multiple cultures because clay is universally available and fire is universally understood, and the need to store water and grain is universally felt. Agriculture appears independently in multiple regions because the observation that seeds produce plants is not difficult to make. Fishing nets, stone tools, basic shelters. These technologies are simple enough and obvious enough that independent invention is not merely plausible, but expected. But independent invention does not explain why cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years converge on the same base 60 mathematics optimized for celestial calculation. It does not explain why they encode the same processional numbers into their mythology. It does not explain why they align their most sacred monuments to the same stars and the same solar events with the same obsessive precision. It does not explain why they build with the same polygonal seismic techniques using stones far larger than structural necessity requires. The details are too specific, too consistent, too mathematically precise to be attributed to parallel accident. What the pattern suggests is not a single lost civilization, not one empire that ruled the world and then vanished, but something subtler and in many ways more profound, a shared inheritance. A body of knowledge, astronomical, mathematical, architectural, hydraulic, that existed before the cultures we call ancient, that survived the catastrophe of the Younger Dryas in fragmented form, and that was carried forward by survivors who dispersed across the globe and seeded it into the civilizations that emerged afterward, like a genetic code expressing itself differently in different environments, but producing the same fundamental structures wherever it takes root. The pattern is not proof. It is something quieter than proof, but more persistent. It is the shape that emerges when you stop looking at the pieces and start looking at the spaces between them, the way a melody emerges not from individual notes, but from the relationships that connect them. History is not a line. It is not even a spiral. It is a pattern, recursive self, similar echoing across scales of time so vast that only stone and sky and number are stable enough to carry the signal. And the signal, faint but unmistakable, says the same thing from every corner of the ancient world we were here before. We knew this before, and we encoded what we knew into the only materials that could outlast the forgetting. The earth warns before it resets. It always has. Not in words, not in prophecy, not in the dramatic pronouncements of oracles, or the fevered visions of mystics, but in the quiet language of its own systems, a language written in temperature gradients and ocean currents, and the slow migration of species toward poles they have never previously inhabited. The warnings are not hidden. They are published in ice cores and sediment layers, and tree rings, and coral growth patterns written in a script that requires no translation, only attention. The problem has never been that the Earth does not communicate. The problem is that human civilizations absorbed in the urgencies of politics and commerce and war rarely possess the institutional patience to listen to a planet that speaks in centuries. We measure our crises in news cycles. The Earth measures its warnings in millennia, and by the time the signal is loud enough for the short-lived to hear, the window for response is usually already closed. The Younger Dryas left warnings that we can now read retroactively encoded in the geological record with a clarity that is almost accusatory. For centuries before the impact event, the climate had been warming. The great ice sheets of the Pleistocene were in retreat, melting slowly back toward the poles, after their long advance releasing fresh water into the Atlantic in quantities that altered the salinity and temperature of ocean currents. The Gulf Stream, that vast conveyor of warm water from the tropics to the North Atlantic, was already under stress, its circulation patterns disrupted by the influx of glacial meltwater, its ability to regulate European temperatures increasingly compromised. This is visible in the proxy records in the oxygen isotope ratios preserved in the shells of foraminifera microscopic marine organisms whose chemical composition reflects the temperature and salinity of the water in which they lived and died and sank to the ocean floor to become part of the sedimentary archive. The warning was there written in the chemistry of creatures too small to see with the naked eye, recording a planet in transition, a climate system approaching a threshold it had not crossed in tens of thousands of years. And then the threshold was crossed, not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of incremental change, but suddenly catastrophically pushed over the edge by an external force that the climate system had no capacity to anticipate. The impact event, whatever its precise nature, did not cause the instability. The instability was already present, building silently in the deep circulation patterns of the ocean and the thinning margins of the ice sheets and the shifting distributions of rainfall across continents. The impact was the trigger, the final weight added to a system already balanced on the edge of transformation. And the transformation, when it came, was not proportional to the trigger. It was exponential, a cascade of feedback loops, each one amplifying the next, each one pushing the system further from the equilibrium it had maintained for the previous 1,000 years. Ice reflected more sunlight, cooling the surface further, growing more ice. Fresh water disrupted ocean currents, reducing heat transport to the north, accelerating glacial advance. Forests died back, reducing the carbon dioxide absorption that had been moderating atmospheric chemistry, allowing temperatures to fall further still. The system did not adjust. It collapsed rapidly, violently, and with consequences that no living organism on the planet's surface could have predicted or prevented. The megafauna died. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic extinction event like the one that ended the Cretaceous, but in a drawn-out wave of disappearances that swept across the northern hemisphere in rough synchrony with the advancing cold and the collapsing ecosystems. Woolly mammoths that had grazed the grasslands of Eurasia and North America for hundreds of thousands of years found their habitats shrinking, their food sources vanishing, their migratory corridors blocked by expanding ice and rising water. Mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, species that had survived multiple glacial cycles and adapted to a wide range of climatic conditions, all disappeared within a few thousand years of the Younger Dryas onset. The conventional debate over whether these extinctions were caused by climate change or human hunting misses the point. The extinctions were caused by a system in collapse, a world whose ecological foundations had been destabilized so thoroughly that even the most resilient species could not adapt quickly enough to survive. The warning the megafauna embodied was simple and brutal. When the system shifts size and strength and evolutionary success are no protection. Only adaptability matters. Only the ability to change faster than the environment is changing. Only the willingness to let go of what worked before and find something new. The humans who survived the Younger Dryas were not the strongest or the most numerous. They were the most adaptable, the ones who could shift from hunting mammoth to fishing rivers, from gathering forest plants to cultivating wild grains, from following migratory herds across open grassland to building permanent settlements on high ground above the floodwaters. They survived because they could read the warnings not in the geological sense that modern scientists read them, but in the immediate experiential sense of people whose lives depended on paying attention to changes in weather and water and the behavior of animals and the yield of wild plants. They noticed when the rivers changed course. They noticed when the herd stopped coming. They noticed when the winters grew longer and the summers cooler and the storms more violent. And they responded not with denial or ideology or institutional paralysis, but with action, moving, adapting, preserving what they could, abandoning what they could not, carrying the knowledge that mattered most in the most durable form they could find. The warning, then, is not about a specific catastrophe. It is about the nature of systems, climatic, ecological, civilizational, and the way they behave when they approach thresholds. Complex systems do not degrade gracefully. They maintain the appearance of stability until the moment they don't, absorbing stress and distributing it across their internal networks, until the network's capacity is exceeded, and then they collapse not incrementally, but all at once in cascades, that are vastly disproportionate to the final trigger that initiated them. The Younger Dryas is a case study in threshold dynamics. The system was stressed. The stress was visible in the proxy records. The trigger was external and unpredictable, and the collapse when it came remade the surface of the planet in ways that no one living at the time could have imagined possible. The ice cores tell this story with crystalline precision, each layer a year, each bubble of trapped air a sample of the atmosphere as it existed at the moment of deposition. Each shift in isotope ratio, a measurement of temperature change so exact that modern climatologists can reconstruct the progression of the Younger Dryas season by season, decade by decade, watching the world cool and collapse in slow motion through the archive of frozen time. The Earth warns before it resets. The warnings are not dramatic. They are statistical subtle shifts in baseline conditions, gradual departures from long-term averages, small anomalies that accumulate until they are no longer small. The ocean warms a fraction of a degree. The ice thins by a few centimeters per year. The seasons shift by a few days per century. The migrations begin a week earlier. The storms arrive with slightly more energy. None of these changes taken individually would alarm anyone who was not specifically looking for them. But taken together, read as a system rather than as isolated data points, they compose a sentence that the Earth has written before and will write again, a sentence that the ancient world learned to read only after it was too late, and that we are reading now in our own ice cores and our own ocean temperatures, and our own migrating species and our own thinning glaciers, wondering whether this time we will listen before the exhale comes. The Earth is patient. The Earth does not repeat its warnings. It simply continues writing them in the same slow script it has always used and waits to see if anyone is paying attention. Look up. Before electricity, before glass, before rooftops and ceilings, and the perpetual amber glow of cities that never sleep, every human who ever lived spent their nights beneath the same unfiltered sky. They did not choose to watch the stars. The stars were simply there, unavoidable, overwhelming, rotating above them in patterns so consistent and so slow that a single lifetime could barely detect their drift. But generations could, centuries could. And somewhere in the long accumulation of nights spent watching, someone noticed that the sky was not random. It was a clock. It was a calendar. It was a map. And once that realization took hold, once the connection between what happened above and what happened below became visible, everything changed. The sky became the first textbook, the first library, the first laboratory, and the Earth became the place where its lessons were written in stone, so that they would never be forgotten even if every living memory of the watchers was extinguished. The relationship between sky and Earth is not metaphorical. It is mechanical, gravitational, electromagnetic and tidal. The moon pulls the oceans twice a day, raising and lowering the water along every coastline on the planet, in a rhythm so reliable that ancient navigators could predict its timing to the minute without instruments. The sun drives the seasons not symbolically, not through the intervention of a gods who must be appeased, but through the tilt of Earth's axis, a 23.5-degree lean, that causes the northern and southern hemispheres to alternately face toward and away from the sun over the course of each year, producing the cycles of warmth and cold and growth and dormancy upon which all terrestrial life depends. The planets move through the sky in patterns that repeat with mathematical precision. Venus returning to the same position every 8 years, Jupiter and Saturn converging every 20 years, the full cycle of the zodiac completing its slow rotation every 26,000 years as Earth's axis wobbles like a spinning top in the grip of the sun and Moon's combined gravitational pull. These are not mystical phenomena, they are physics, and the ancient world knew them not in the language of modern science, not with equations and orbital mechanics, but with a practical observational precision that in some cases exceeded what Europe would achieve until the Renaissance. The Maya calculated Venus's 584-day synodic period with an error of only 2 hours over 500 years of observation. They understood that 5 Venus cycles equaled exactly 8 Earth years, a mathematical harmony so elegant that they wove it into their calendars, their mythology, and the orientation of their observatories. El Caracol at Chichen Itza, the cylindrical tower with its spiral staircase and carefully positioned windows, was not aimed at the cardinal directions, but at the extreme rising and setting positions of Venus, as if the builders considered Venus more important than the compass, points more fundamental than north and south and east and west. And perhaps they were right. Venus is the brightest object in the sky after the sun and moon. Its appearances and disappearances as morning star and evening star, vanishing for weeks between phases, made it a natural marker for agricultural timing, navigation, and the ritualistic ordering of social life. To track Venus with the precision the Maya achieved requires not just observation but mathematics, not just mathematics but record keeping, not just record keeping but institutional continuity generation after generation of trained watchers, passing their data forward, correcting errors, refining calculations, building a body of astronomical knowledge so deep that it could predict celestial events centuries in advance. The Egyptians performed the same feat with different stars. The heliacal rising of Sirius, its first appearance above the eastern horizon just before dawn, after a 70-day absence, coincided with the annual flooding of the Nile, the event upon which all Egyptian agriculture, and therefore all Egyptian civilization, depended. The Egyptians did not merely notice this coincidence. They built their entire calendar around it, dividing the year into 3 seasons defined by the Nile's behaviour, each season governed by the position of stars that marked its beginning and end. The Great Pyramid's southern shaft points directly at Orion's belt, the constellation the Egyptians associated with Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, while the northern shaft points toward Thuban, the pole star of the 3rd millennium BCE. These are not decorative alignments. These are functional orientations embedding the pyramid into the structure of the sky itself, making it not just a monument but a marker, a fixed point connecting the geometry of Earth to the geometry of the heavens with a precision that required intimate knowledge of both. At Tiwanaku on the Bolivian Altiplano, the Kalasasaya temple's standing stones frame the sunrise at both solstices, creating a solar observatory that tracks the extremes of the sun's annual journey with architectural precision. Some researchers have argued that the alignment encodes not just the current obliquity of Earth's axis, but a historical obliquity, a measurement of the axial tilt as it existed thousands of years before the temple's conventional construction date, suggesting either that the site is far older than mainstream archaeology accepts, or that the builders possessed astronomical knowledge, inherited from a much earlier tradition of observation. In either case, the implication is the same. Someone was watching the sky with extraordinary care for an extraordinarily long time, and they encoded what they learned into structures designed to preserve that knowledge across periods far longer than any written language or oral tradition could reliably span. This is the deepest connection between sky and earth, not the romantic connection of poets who see meaning in starlight, but the engineering connection of builders who understood that the sky is the only reference frame, stable enough to anchor knowledge across millennia. Languages change, scripts become unreadable, oral traditions distort with each retelling, institutions crumble, libraries burn, but the stars return to the same positions in the same cycles with the same mathematical reliability, century after century, millennium after millennium, for as long as the solar system holds its shape. If you want to encode a message that will survive the collapse of your civilization, you do not write it in a language that will be forgotten. You write it in the geometry of the sky carved into stone that will not rot aligned to celestial events, that will repeat with clockwork regularity long after your cities have fallen and your name has been erased from every record. You let the sky be your alphabet and the earth be your page, and you trust that someone someday will look up and look down and notice that the two are saying the same thing. The ancient builders did not worship the sky in the way that modern people sometimes imagine prostrating themselves before celestial deities out of ignorance and fear. They studied the sky the way a navigator studies the ocean, the way a farmer studies the soil, the way an engineer studies the forces that will act upon the structure they are about to build. They studied it because their survival depended on understanding it, because the cycles of the sky governed the cycles of the earth, because the movements of the sun and moon and stars dictated when to plant and when to harvest, and when the rivers would flood and when the seasons would turn. And they built their understanding into their most permanent creations, not as decoration, but as insurance, and guarantee that even if every book was burned, and every teacher killed, and every city drowned, the knowledge would survive embedded in angles and alignments and proportions that the sky itself would verify, for anyone patient enough to watch and measure and remember. The sky does not forget. The sky simply turns, carrying its ancient lessons across the darkness, waiting for the next civilization to look up and begin the long work of reading what was written there before the last world ended and the waters rose and the silence began. You have been here before, not you specifically, not the body you inhabit, not the name you carry, not the particular arrangement of memories and preferences and habits that you call your identity, but something in you has been here before, standing at the edge of knowledge and looking out over the vast dark territory of what has been forgotten, feeling the strange pull of recognition that has no source you can name. It is the feeling you get when you visit ruins for the first time and something in your chest tightens, not with sadness exactly, but with a familiarity that has no right to exist. It is the feeling you get when you hear a melody from a tradition not your own and find tears forming for reasons your conscious mind cannot explain. It is the feeling that settles over you in the quiet hours before dawn when the world is still and the stars are visible and something ancient in your nervous system whispers that this silence is not new, that you have stood in this exact quality of darkness before, that the distance between you and the people who carved Göbekli Tepe and aligned the pyramids and walked stone giants across Easter Island is not as vast as the calendar insists. The return is not a journey to a place. It is a recognition that you never entirely left. The cycles make this inevitable. The Earth tilts and wobbles on its axis in a rhythm that takes 26,000 years to complete the great precessional cycle that shifts the position of the equinox sunrise slowly backward through the zodiac degree by degree, constellation by constellation, at a rate so slow that no single human lifetime can detect it without precise measurement and multi-generational record keeping. And yet culture after culture on continent after continent encoded this cycle into their mythology and their architecture and their sacred calendars, as if they understood that the sky was not static, but turning, that the age they lived in was not permanent, but transitional, that the constellations that marked their epoch would eventually give way to new ones, and the whole cycle would begin again. The Hindu concept of the yuga, the idea that time moves through repeating ages of gold and silver and bronze and iron, each one shorter and more degraded than the last until the cycle resets, and the golden age returns, is not unique to India. It appears in Greek mythology, as the ages of man in Norse mythology, as the cycle of Ragnarok and renewal in Mesoamerican cosmology, as the succession of world ages or suns, each one ending in cataclysm and giving birth to the next. These are not primitive attempts to explain a universe that the tellers did not understand. These are sophisticated models of cyclical time frameworks for comprehending a reality in which creation and destruction are not opposites, but phases of the same process, the way inhale and exhale are not opposites, but phases of the same breath. The return is built into the structure of the cosmos itself. Stars that set below the horizon rise again. Seasons that end come back. Rivers that flood recede and flood again. Species that go extinct are replaced by new species that fill the same ecological niches with the same solutions to the same problems. Wings for flight, fins for swimming, eyes for seeing as if the blueprints persist, even when the organisms that carried them do not. The universe does not move in straight lines. It moves in spirals, in orbits, in oscillations that return to their starting conditions with the reliability of mathematics and the patience of gravity, and civilizations embedded in this cosmos subject to the same forces shaped by the same cycles may follow the same pattern, rising, flourishing, forgetting the conditions that allowed their rise, exceeding the capacity of their environment to sustain them, collapsing and then rising again from the ruins, carrying fragments of what was known before rebuilding, with the partial memory of people who remember that something important once existed, but cannot quite recall what it was. This is what the ancient sites feel like when you stand among them. Not dead, not finished, not concluded. They feel like something waiting. The stones of Sacsayhuaman do not feel like relics of a departed civilization. They feel like anchors, fixed points in a rotating world holding something in place that will be needed again when the cycle comes around. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe, buried deliberately under thousands of tons of earth, do not feel like abandoned monuments. They feel like seeds planted in the ground with the same intentionality with which a farmer plants grain, not because the harvest will come tomorrow, but because the planter understands that seasons return and what is buried will eventually need to be unearthed. The pyramids of Giza, aligned to stars that have since drifted from their original positions due to precession, do not feel like static memorials to dead kings. They feel like clocks marking a specific moment in the precessional cycle, encoding a specific configuration of the sky, waiting for the stars to return to those positions 26,000 years later, so that someone standing at the base can look up and say, yes, this is when it was built, this is what they knew, this is the age they were recording. The return is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with trumpets or earthquakes or celestial signs blazing across the sky. It comes quietly the way dawn comes, not as a sudden explosion of light, but as a slow, almost imperceptible brightening at the horizon, a gradual shift from black to grey, to the pale blue that precedes the first visible edge of the sun. You do not notice the exact moment night becomes day. You only realize at some point that you can see again. The return of knowledge works the same way. It does not arrive in a single revelation. It accumulates one discovery at a time, one connection at a time, one researcher, noticing that the alignment at this site matches the alignment at that site. One engineer recognizing that the construction technique in Peru is functionally identical to the construction technique in Japan, one linguist observing that the flood myth in Mesopotamia carries the same structural DNA as the flood myth in Mesoamerica. The pattern emerges slowly resisted at every step by the institutional inertia of disciplines that have organized their understanding around a timeline that the evidence is quietly dismantling. We are in a return now. Not a return to the ancient world, that world is gone drowned and buried and dissolved beyond physical recovery, but a return to the questions that the ancient world embedded in its most durable creations. The questions were never lost. They were carved into stone and aligned to stars and encoded in myths that survived every empire that tried to replace them with newer stories. They waited through the dark centuries after the cataclysm, through the slow rebuilding, through the rise and fall of Egypt and Sumer and Rome, and every civilization that followed through the medieval period, when the knowledge of the ancients was dismissed as pagan superstition through the Enlightenment, when it was dismissed as primitive mythology, through the modern era when it was dismissed as archaeological anomaly. The questions waited because they were patient, and because they were made of materials that do not decay stone and geometry, and the eternal repetition of celestial cycles. And now, with ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR and sonar mapping, and satellite imaging and the slow accumulation of data from every continent, the questions are becoming visible again, not because they have changed, but because we have finally developed instruments sensitive enough to hear what the stones have been saying all along. The return is not the discovery of something new. It is the rediscovery of something very old, the recognition that the spiral has come around again, that we are standing where others have stood before, looking at the same stars, asking the same questions, and beginning slowly to hear the same answers rising from the silence of the ancient earth. So here you are, at the end of a journey that began at the bottom of the ocean, in the dark, in the sediment, where time compresses itself into layers thin enough to hold between your fingers. You have travelled through evidence and anomaly, through silence and forgotten epochs, through resets and echoes and patterns and warnings, through the ancient marriage of sky and earth, through the slow turning of cycles that bring the same questions back to the same species standing on the same ground, looking up at the same stars, wondering the same thing that every civilization before them has wondered: are we the first or are we the latest? And now the journey asks you not to answer that question, but to sit with it the way you sit with the sound of rain on a roof, not analysing it, not solving it, not converting it into data or argument or opinion, but simply letting it be present, letting it fill the room with its quiet ancient rhythm, letting it remind you that some things do not need to be resolved in order to be understood. The ancients did not lack technology. They had a different technology, one that prioritized permanence over speed harmony over extraction, memory over novelty. They built with stone because stone endures. They aligned to stars because stars are reliable across millennia. They encoded knowledge in geometry because mathematics does not decay the way language decays, the way paper decays, the way digital storage will eventually decay when the servers go dark and the electricity stops, and the cloud dissolves into the atmosphere from which it borrowed its name. They thought in centuries. They planned in generations. They understood something that our civilization, for all its brilliance and power, has largely forgotten, that the measure of a technology is not how fast it operates, but how long it lasts, not how much it produces, but how much it preserves, not how dramatically it transforms the present, but how gracefully it carries the past into the future. Their monuments were not displays of power. They were acts of transmission letters written in stone, and starlight addressed to recipients who had not yet been born, sealed with the only postage that the ancient world trusted to survive the journey: mass precision and celestial alignment. You do not need to believe in a single lost civilization to feel the weight of what the evidence suggests. You do not need to accept every alternative theory or reject every conventional explanation. What the stones ask of you is simpler and more difficult than belief. They ask for humility, the willingness to admit that the story we have been telling about human progress, the neat upward line from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge, from caves to computers, may be incomplete. Not wrong necessarily, but incomplete in the way that a map drawn from a single vantage point is incomplete, accurate for what it shows, but silent about everything beyond its edges. The edges of our map are the coastlines that drowned the libraries, that rotted the cities, that were buried under sand and sediment, the millennia of human experience that left no trace in a record, biased toward what survives rather than what existed. Humility is not weakness. It is the foundation of every genuine discovery, the recognition that what we do not know is vaster than what we do, and that the unknown is not a threat to be conquered, but a territory to be explored with the same patience and attention that the ancient skywatchers brought to their long vigil beneath the turning stars. Let the knowledge settle, not into certainty. Certainty is brittle, and brittle things break when the ground shifts. Let it settle into something more resilient, something closer to what the Inca builders achieved with their polygonal walls, a structure that can flex under pressure without fracturing, that accommodates the unexpected without collapsing, that holds together not through rigidity, but through the precise fitting of irregular pieces into a whole greater than the sum of its parts. Let the mystery remain a mystery, not because answers are impossible, but because the question itself is more valuable than any answer could be. The question is what keeps you looking. The question is what keeps you humble. The question is what connects you across 12,000 years of silence to the hands that carved Göbekli Tepe and buried it under the earth and walked away, trusting that someone someday would dig it up and understand why it mattered. The night is deep now. The stars are turning overhead in their ancient patterns, the same patterns they traced when the ice was 2 miles thick, and the mammoths grazed the tundra, and the world was a place you would not recognize but would somehow inexplicably remember. The dust of 10,000 years is settling around you, soft as breath, quiet as the space between heartbeats. You're not the first to lie here in the dark, wondering what came before, feeling the pull of something older than your name, and you will not be the last. The spiral continues, the cycle turns, the stones remain patient as gravity, precise as mathematics, silent as the space between stars, and somewhere beneath the surface of everything you think you know, the ancient rhythm continues, the one that carried knowledge through the flood, through the fire, through the long silence, through the forgetting, all the way to this moment, this breath, this quiet recognition that you are part of something that did not begin with you and will not end with you. Rest now. The stones will keep watch. They have been watching for a very long time, and they are very, very good at it. Let your eyes close. Let the dark come. Let the rhythm carry you the way it has carried everything, slowly, gently, deeper than memory, older than stone. We've reached the edge of tonight's journey, traveller. The stones have spoken, the stars have turned, The sediment has settled back into its ancient layers, and the silence that began at the bottom of the ocean has come full circle, arriving here in this room, in this quiet, in the warmth of wherever you are resting now. The journey is complete. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. You do not need to hold the names of sites, or the weights of stones, or the dates of cataclysms in the front of your mind. 14,000 words have passed through you like water, through limestone, slowly, quietly dissolving channels. You cannot see shaping something beneath the surface that does not require your conscious attention to exist. The knowledge has settled where it needs to settle. It has found its own level the way water always does, the way sediment always does, the way memory always does when you stop trying to hold it and simply let it rest. In the end, traveller, it is all right to not understand. The ancient builders did not understand everything either. They watched, they measured, they carved what they could into stone, and they trusted that the act of paying attention was enough. It was. It is. Let gravity hold you. Let the questions fade. Let your body become heavy the way stone becomes heavy, not with burden, but with belonging, with the deep settled weight of something that has found its place and intends to stay. Your breath is slowing. Your thoughts are thinning. The dark is warm and the silence is kind, and the long spiral of history is turning without you tonight, as it has always turned patient and vast and older than anything that has ever needed a name. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight the universe whispers again, "Sleep, traveller. The cosmos will keep watch."